Begin the program with the war in Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin says he's debuted a new intermediate-range ballistic missile, launching it at the eastern Ukrainian city of Dnipro. The attack took place on Thursday, and initially there was debate over what exactly Russia had fired after Kyiv accused Moscow of using an intercontinental ballistic missile in the strike. It's a weapon capable of hitting targets thousands of miles away. Putin was speaking in a televised speech on Thursday, during which he also issued a stark warning to the West amid what's been an escalation of cross-border fire. Well, let's cross over to the Ukrainian capital and speak to Gulliver Cragg, our correspondent there. So, Gulliver Cragg, update us on the situation there in Ukraine. We've obviously had this announcement from Putin that it's definitely not an intercontinental ballistic missile. What's been the reaction to that in Ukraine?
Well, I can give you a clarification which came from the Pentagon, actually, which is that this new missile that the Russians, in their own words, tested yesterday on the Ukrainian city of Dnipro is derived from the Rubezh intercontinental ballistic missile, which is what the Ukrainians initially thought it was. So they weren't exaggerating. You know, they had good reason to think that that's what it was. And an intermediate range ballistic missile is still a much longer range weapon than the Russians have used thus far in this conflict, and they have never used this particular missile before at all. It's a missile that can carry a nuclear warhead, though it wouldn't be the first weapon that could carry a nuclear warhead that has been used in this war of Russia against Ukraine. They quite often actually fire missiles that could potentially carry nuclear warheads, but obviously not carrying nuclear warheads, and yesterday it wasn't either. The Ukrainians see this as a strategy by Vladimir Putin to try to spook the West, perhaps more than them themselves. What they're worried about, as much as the further attacks, is that this escalation by Vladimir Putin, or as the Russians put it, this response to what they call an escalation by the West, when the United States and the United Kingdom gave Ukraine permission to fire missiles that they'd supplied into Russia at targets in Russia, which the Ukrainians promptly did. Ukrainians now are worried that the Western allies may be afraid to give them more of these missiles that they've been firing into Russia. Also, the decision to supply landmines that was made by the United States or announced yesterday, that the West and other countries may not be prepared to join up because they're afraid of this escalation. And the Ukrainians are more afraid of that than of the escalation itself, because they absolutely need this help if they're to stop the Russian advance in eastern Ukraine, where it keeps taking more territory by the day.
Well, Gulliver, update us on what's actually going on then on the front lines.
Well, it's mostly around the town of Kurakovy, which is at the southern end of the part of Donetsk region still controlled by Ukraine. That's the Donbass in the east of the country. And south of this town, Kurakovy, the Russian forces are advancing every day. The latest village that they apparently took yesterday, according to OSINT observers, is a village called Dalny. These are tiny villages that have been pretty much completely destroyed long since, actually, because the fighting has been very intense there. But it's strategically important for the Russians to surround and try to take this town of Kurakovy. There are several other towns where there's fighting going on in the town centre itself in Donbass. Further to the north, the Ukrainians are holding the line better in the north of the part of Donetsk region that they control, and then further north into Kharkiv, where they've been able to repel attempts by the Russians to take the town of Kupiansk, which leads some observers to say that if only the Ukrainian armed forces would reorganize themselves and put the best commanders, as it were, in charge of larger groups of forces, then they might be able to hold the line better. But clearly they are at a very significant disadvantage in terms of both manpower and firepower.
Gulliver Cragg, our correspondent there in Kyiv, thanks so much for bringing us up to speed there.